On August 11th, 2019, we began our study of the book of Ruth. We took a little break from it during the Christmas season, preached a series of Advent sermons. Then we got back to it in January. And then on March 8th, I preached the 16th sermon in the series. The following Sunday, I was at the men's retreat, and the following Sunday is when we shut things down. And so it just all came to a screeching halt. And I can't tell you how much I've looked forward to getting back to the book of Ruth. I thought it was just starting to get really interesting. And then we shut her down, and we've been away from it for 10 weeks. After 10 weeks, I really don't feel right about just jumping right in and picking up where we left off, because where we left off is an ancient memory by now. So what I want to do this morning is a quick review. I want to do three things. First, I want to review the first two chapters, because where we left off was chapter 2, verse 20, almost last verse of chapter 2. And it really put us about halfway through the book. Actually, we're in the text we just read this morning, but that's where we were, about halfway through. So I'm going to review where we've been, and then I'm going to spend a little more time reviewing the last two messages, because the last two messages were really setting the stage for the next message, which will be easier understood and appreciated if we remember what went on in the two sermons before. So that's what I'm going to do this morning. So you can turn to the very first chapter if you want, just kind of follow along as I hit some high points. The very first verse of the book says this: "It came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." There's a lot packed in that little verse. For one thing, we learned that this happened during the time of the judges. That tells us a number of things. This was a time when God was dealing directly and openly with the nation of Israel. He would bless them when they walked with Him. He would judge them when they didn't. And throughout the book of Judges, there are 7 cycles that go through national backsliding, and then divine judgment, and then national repentance, and then divine restitution and blessing. And it happens time and time again throughout the book of Judges. The fact that this story begins with a famine suggests that it was during one of those down cycles that this story began to happen. There was a famine in the land. This tells us God is judging the people. Apparently they've backslidden, they've turned away from Him. The purpose of the famine was to get their attention and have them turn back to God. But there was a little family that lived in Bethlehem who, instead of repenting, decided to retreat. Dad was Elimelech, Mom was Naomi, and they had a couple of sons, Machlon and Chilion. And instead of trusting God to provide for them in Israel, they decided to take their chances in Moab. They heard there was food in Moab, so they packed up their little family, and they left the promised land of Israel to live in the godless land of Moab. Things did not turn out well. First, Jewish men were expected to marry Jewish women. And I'm not being racist when I say that. This is ancient Israel. That was how it happened. That was what the expectation was. Instead, their 2 boys ended up marrying a couple of Moabite girls. Each of them were married for 10 years. Neither of them had any children. Now, this was not due to family planning. This is an indication of divine judgment in their lives. So the first thing is, their sons married Moabite women. I said it didn't turn out well. One is because the sons married Moabite women. The second reason is because Elimelech died. He paid a high price for his wandering away from God's land. And the third thing was that then the 2 sons died. And Naomi and her 2 widowed daughters-in-law seemed to be trying to make their way all by themselves. You know, I always think when I read a story like this about Proverbs 16, it says, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death." I think that Elimelech and Naomi thought they were making a good choice when they went to Moab. There's food in Moab. Yes, but what about trusting God to provide for you in the promised land? Yeah, but there's food in Moab. And so they made their choice. There's a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. And in fact, that's just how it ended for Elimelech and Naomi. And I think it's really a warning for you and I. So Elimelech has died. His 2 sons have died. Now Naomi is all alone. And what I love about the story about Naomi is she illustrates the fact that God is the God of a second chance. She decides it's time to go back to Bethlehem. So she pulls her two daughters-in-law aside. She explains to them, I'm going back to Bethlehem, but you all need to stay here. Go back to your Moabite families, go back to your Moabite gods, and I will go back to Bethlehem all by myself. One daughter-in-law, Orpah, agreed and stepped out of the pages of the story and out of the history, and we don't know any more about her. The other said, nothing doing. I'm going with you. And Ruth said, I will follow you wherever you go. In fact, if you're looking at chapter 1, verse 16, Ruth says this, thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. This is a conversion story. It's one of the most remarkable conversion stories in all of the Bible. There are a number of reasons that make it remarkable. One thing that makes it remarkable is she really didn't have much encouragement to trust Israel's God. I mean, think about her mother-in-law for a moment. Naomi was hardly an outstanding witness for her God. She will later accuse God of stripping her of everything and making her bitter and all this ugly stuff. You got to think she wasn't much of a testimony, especially when she told her daughters-in-law, go back to your mothers and go back to your gods. Naomi didn't try to evangelize Ruth. That's pretty evident from the text. And yet, Ruth will embrace Naomi's God. See, to me, that's a remarkable story. Another thing that makes it a remarkable story is the fact that Ruth is still young. She's probably mid-20s at this point in her life. She's got her life in front of her. And yes, she has been widowed, but life didn't end. She can marry someone else, and she can make a life for herself. But if she goes to Israel, and she's an outsider, a Moabite, the chances of finding a husband there are pretty much slim to none. The fact that she chose to embrace Naomi's God and go to Bethlehem with Naomi is really just a remarkable fact. And then another thing I find fascinating is verse 17, where Ruth says this, the Lord do so to me. Now stop and look at the word Lord in your text, 1 to 17. You'll notice this is all capital letters. I've told you before, that's always an indication from the translators that they are translating the Israeli name for God, Yahweh or Jehovah. We really don't know how to say it. But this is the covenant-keeping God. This is the God of Israel. This pagan Moabite woman says, I will follow your God, and I called that God to witness if aught but death parts you and me. It's a great conversion story. And it just strikes me that if God could save this Moabite woman, this godless pagan woman, probably a worshiper of Chemosh. Chemosh was the fish god. They sacrificed children to Chemosh. If God could save this woman, God can save anybody. And if you haven't yet trusted Christ as your Savior, God can save you as well. Well, they arrived in Bethlehem. Naomi received a hero's welcome. She had grown up there, and it was a small town. Everybody knew everybody. And so the ladies come out to meet her, and they say, is this Naomi? Now remember, there's a play on words here, because the name Naomi means pleasant. So what she heard when they came out was, is this pleasant? And do you remember her response? She said, don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara. That word means bitter. So what she says is, they say, is this pleasant? She says, don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter. And then she complains about what God has done to her. God has made me bitter. God has taken everything from me. I went out full. I came back empty. God has turned against me. God has broken me. Now the reality is that God had done none of those things to her. The things that happened to her were the result of her and Elimelech's choice. Isn't it funny how when people get sideways with God, they want to blame him for the bad things that happened, as if God did something wrong? You want God's blessing in your life, you need to walk in the way of God's blessing. Now that doesn't protect you from bad things, don't get me wrong, that's not some magical charm, but don't blame God when you have to suffer the results of your own choices. Choices have consequences. Well, they arrived at Bethlehem at an opportune time. The text tells us it was the beginning of the barley harvest. Now that gives us kind of a note of time. That tells us it was somewhere near the end of April or beginning of May, just kind of about this time of year. And the Jews had a work program for the destitute. Poor people, instead of starving, they didn't have food stamps or giveaways. But during harvest time, poor people were allowed to go to the fields where they were harvesting and pick up whatever the harvesters missed. They called it gleaning. So poor people could go in the fields and glean whatever the harvesters missed. In chapter 2, Ruth decides to take advantage of that. Understand that she and Naomi are really destitute. It's probably desperate at this point. They don't have anything. What are they going to eat? How are they going to live? So Ruth says to Naomi, I'm going to go glean in the fields. And Naomi's response, remember, was pretty terse. She says, go, my daughter. And the Hebrew is even more terse than that. It's just 2 words. Go, girl. And it's not, you go, girl. It's go, girl. You got to wonder if she wasn't somewhat depressed. Now, I'm not a psychoanalyst, so I'm not going to psychoanalyze a woman, but this is not great. So, Ruth goes. Doesn't have a clue where she's going. She's a Moabite. She looks like a Moabite. She sounds like a Moabite. She doesn't know anybody in Bethlehem, but she just happened to light in the field of a man named Boaz. Of course, we know she didn't just happen there. This is the sovereignty of God directing her steps. And this man, Boaz, rolled out the red carpet and showed her extraordinary kindness. He said, don't go to any other fields but mine, and when we move from field to field, you can follow my workers. He told his men, keep your hands off that girl and don't shame her in any way. He fed her from his own table, and he showed her hesed. Now, y'all remember the word hesed. It's become probably my favorite Hebrew word. It's a word that describes God. It's a word that is really not translatable in English, because we don't have a single word that will capture the meaning of hesed. My understanding is there's no other language that will do justice to the word hesed. The thing about hesed is, if you take all of the positive attributes of God, His mercy, His love, His kindness, His forgiveness, His grace, His favor, His concern, His benevolence, His faithfulness, pack it all into that one little word, and now you've got an idea of what hesed means. My favorite definition of hesed is when the person from whom I have a right to expect nothing gives me everything. That is hesed. Isn't that how God has loved us? What do we have a right to expect from God? And the answer is nothing. Nothing. And yet, God gives us everything. God extends hesed to His people, and then He expects His people to extend hesed to others, and that's exactly what Boaz did for Ruth. She had no right to expect anything from Boaz. And yet Boaz essentially gave her everything. Well, Ruth worked really hard in the field of Boaz that day. When she gathered all of her barley, she had somewhere between 5.8 and 9.5 gallons of threshed barley. That was enough to feed her and Naomi for the next 2 weeks. She got home with that grain, and Naomi's eyes bugged out. She said, where did you glean today? Where did you get all that barley? And Ruth says, well, I gleaned in the field of a guy named Boaz. And the light bulb went on in Naomi's mind. Boaz? Boaz. Look at chapter 2 and verse 20. Chapter 2, verse 20. And it would help if the preacher had his Bible open to the right text. Chapter 2, verse 20. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord who has not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. Naomi said to her, the man, Boaz, is near of kin to us. He's one of our near kinsmen. Now that phrase, near kinsman, next kinsman, translates the Hebrew word goel, and it could also be translated kinsman redeemer, which leads to the second point of this message. I told you I want to do three things. One, I want to review the first 2 chapters, which we've just done. 2, I want to reintroduce you to the idea of the kinsman redeemer. As far as I know, this whole concept of the kinsman redeemer is unique to Israel. I've never heard tell of it in any other culture. It's unique to them. Here's how Baker's Dictionary of the Bible defines it. A kinsman redeemer is a male relative who, according to various laws found in the Pentateuch, had the privilege or responsibility to act for a relative who was in trouble. So if you got in a bind, a male relative could step in and bail you out. Now, the way this is going to play out in our story has to do with real estate. Specifically, the real estate that had belonged to Elimelech. Real estate laws in ancient Israel were designed to keep property with certain families. God gave them the land during the time of Joshua, and God intended that the land stay in those family groups from then on. If, however, you fell on hard times and had to sell your land, you retained the right of redemption. You always had the right to buy it back. But not just you. Because maybe you would never have the money to buy it back, but you had a close relative who was willing to buy it back and give it back to you. The relative could be a brother or an uncle or a cousin. That's the kinsman redeemer. Let's say I lived in ancient Israel and I fell on hard times. I needed cash, so I sold my property. Didn't have a choice. You got to have money to live. But then let's say that I had a wealthy cousin who heard about my plight. And the wealthy cousin came along and said, I will buy that land back for you. Now, it doesn't matter whether the buyer wants to sell it back or not. Legally, they have to sell it back. That's the law of the kinsman redeemer. Now, the cousin can't just buy it for themselves. They have to give it back to me. They might do it on certain terms. Maybe it's a loan. Maybe it's a gift. I'm not sure that it matters. But that's what a kinsman redeemer was. Now, let's go back to the book of Ruth. Naomi had been married to Elimelech. Somehow, Elimelech is related to Boaz. It appears that Elimelech had sold some or all of his property. Naomi has nothing. Ruth comes home with all of his threshed grain, and she says, where did you get that, Ruth? Well, I was gleaning in the field of Boaz. Ruth is clueless. She doesn't know who Boaz is. She never heard of him, never met him, meant nothing to her. And the light bulb goes on in Naomi's mind. Boaz. Boaz. He is near of kin to us. He could be our kinsman redeemer. Can you start to see the wheels turning in her brain? Maybe this is the thing we've been looking for. He could buy back Elimelech's property and restore it to us. That's the kinsman redeemer. And it will play significantly into this story. And I wanted it half fresh in your mind before we go to the next piece of this story. So we've reviewed the first two chapters. We've set up the understanding of the kinsman redeemer. And the third thing I want you to see is the concept of the levirate marriage. Now for this, you need to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 25. That got a few interesting looks. The what did you say? The levirate marriage. I'm going to read Deuteronomy chapter 25, starting in verse 5. I'm reading from the Net Bible. It says this: if brothers live together and one of them dies without having a son, the dead man's wife, and you can say if Machlon and Ruth were living together and he died, Ruth must not remarry somebody outside the family. Instead, her late husband's brother must go to her, marry her, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law. Now, Machlon's brother is dead, right? So it's not going to be an immediate brother. Maybe it's uncle. Maybe it's a cousin. I really don't know what the relationship of Boaz was. But he will go into her and marry her and perform the duty of a brother-in-law. Then the first son she bears will continue the name of the dead brother, thus preventing his name from being blotted out of Israel. This is called levirate marriage. Now, the word levirate has nothing to do with the Levites. It's a Latin word, levir, which means brother-in-law, and that's where that word came from. But suppose that law were in existence today. I, as a man, I had 4 brothers. And let's say that one of my brothers got married and died before they had children. According to this law, I am now obligated to marry his widow, father children by her, and the first son from that union would carry on my dead brother's name. If that were the law today, Do you think if you had 3 brothers, I said 4, didn't I? There were 4 of us. I had 3 brothers. Do you think I would have been really interested in whom my brothers married? And maybe I'd like to have some say in it. Not that one. Don't marry her. I may wind up with her. You see the thinking here? If you were a woman and you were marrying into a family with several brothers, you think you might be a little bit more concerned about those brothers? Because you might wind up with one of them. That's the ancient custom in Israel. You might think it's crazy, but it's God's way of keeping family property in the hands of that family. That's the levirate marriage. Now let's go back to Deuteronomy 25 and keep reading. Verse 7. If the man does not want to marry his brother's widow, I told him he shouldn't have married her, I'm not going to marry her, then she must go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to preserve his brother's name in Israel. He is unwilling to perform the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of his city must summon him and speak to him. If he persists, saying, I do not want to marry her, then his sister-in-law must approach him in view of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, and spit in his face. She will then respond, thus may it be done to any man who does not maintain his brother's family line. His family name will be referred to in Israel as the family of the one whose sandal was removed. Notice how he, by refusing to marry his brother's widow, brings shame not only on himself, but on his family as well. Now I want you to notice a couple of things about this text. First, the widowed sister-in-law had a legal right to expect one of the brother-in-laws to marry her and father children by her. Second, the brother-in-law had a legal duty to do so. And if he did not, then he would be shamed. Notice something else from this text. This woman who has been spurned by her brother-in-law goes to the elders of the gate and says he refuses to marry me. What that suggests is that she has approached him about doing his duty and he has refused. Now in that case, who proposed to whom? Well, obviously she approached him. You know, brother-in-law, my husband's did that a while, and now it's time for you to do your duty. So can we get on with this? Will you marry me? And while that sounds so foreign to us, that's the culture in which this story is written. That's the background of what's taking place. That's what's behind the story that Michael read a few moments in chapter 3 in the first 6 verses. Naomi will instruct Ruth to go claim her due as the widow to Boaz, the Goel, or the kinsman redeemer. She tells her in chapter 3 verses, the first several verses, to do several things. She says, first of all, take a bath. Well, she's been working in the fields all day, she probably stinks. So if you're going to attract a husband, it's not a bad idea. First, take a bath. Then put on some perfume. Perfume was probably some fragranced olive oil, which that just appalls me, the thought of rubbing olive oil all over my face or neck or whatever. But nonetheless, that was their perfume. Then she says, get dressed, put on some clothes. That's a little odd, and it's generated a lot of discussion in the commentaries. I think what's going on is this. Ruth was a widow, and she wore the clothes of a widow. So everybody who looked at her knew she was a widow. I think what's going on is Naomi's saying it's time to put off your widow's clothes, put on some regular clothes, because you're ready now to not be a widow anymore. The fourth thing she says is go to the threshing floor where Boaz was spending the night. They were threshing the grain, so that's where he would be. Fifth thing is kind of keep your distance, watch where he lays down to sleep. Number 6, once he's asleep, you sneak up on him and you uncover the blankets from his feet, which is really odd. But then number 7, you wait further instructions from Boaz. It is so odd. But in that culture and that context, it was appropriate and it was fitting. This is the way Ruth was instructed to claim Boaz as her kinsman redeemer. So that brings us up to date and gets us ready to move on to the text. Before we do, one more backward glance. Initially, it looked like Elimelech and Naomi had really blown it, because they had. They had stepped outside of God's will for their life and left the promised land. God didn't put the Jews in the promised land so they could get running every time there's a famine. God's promise was, I will take care of you if you walk with me. But instead of doing God's way, they moved to Moab and brought disaster on their family. They paid an awful price. Elimelech died, the two boys died, and now Naomi is all alone, and she has made a total mess of her life. What I want you to see about the story is that God is able to take that mess, and God is able to turn it around. Amen. Two themes that come out loudly in the book of Ruth are, number one, God is in control. And number two, God is a God of Hesed. God extends His love and His kindness and His grace and His mercy and His comfort, all those positive things, not because we deserve it, but because He is a God of Hesed. God does not want us to mess up our lives, but folks, regardless of the mess that we make, when we turn back to God, God can put it all back together again, and we're really the turning point in this story. Where pretty much all that we've seen up to this point is it's bad, it's gloom, it's doom, it's despair. God has forsaken me. God has made me bitter. God has taken everything away from me. God has broken me. But at this point, the story begins to turn. And the God of Hesed begins to manifest Himself because Naomi is willing to let Him do so. See, the only thing that prevents God from extending His Hesed to you is your willingness to allow Him to do it. As long as you go your own way and say, I don't need God, I don't want to admit my sins, I've not done anything wrong, you go your way. God's Hesed is locked out. The minute you open up and say, okay, Lord, tired of doing it my way, I'm ready to do it your way, then God can step in. And God can do great and marvelous things that we never thought about in our lives. And that's what's going to happen in this story. Wherever you are in your life, whatever messes you've made, turn those messes over to God. God can put it all back together again and make it better than it was before. Let's pray together, shall we? Father, it's such a marvelous little story that we've been looking at. Thank you for the privilege of getting back to it. I pray as we move forward in the story, our hearts would be encouraged and blessed, and that we would just thrill at what you do in the lives of these women. And Father, help us that we would walk with you, that we would not go the way it seems right to us, but that we would pursue you in our lives and pursue your path and do what you would have us do. And may we, by your grace, continue to experience your mercy and your love and your kindness and your consolation, your grace, your goodness, your faithfulness, your forgiveness. May we continue to experience your Hesed. For Jesus' sake and in His name, amen.